Well, good evening. My name is Jeff Hawks. I'm the Director of Education and Veterans Outreach for the Army Heritage Center Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, Bravo Company, an Afghanistan deployment and its aftermath with Ben Kesling. Ben is a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. He covers the Midwest and the Wall Street Journal Chicago Bureau, where he also writes about national security and veterans issues. He's a graduate of Wabash College with a Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard University. He attended Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and the Middlebury Language School for Arabic. He is also a two-day Jeopardy champion. Ben has won journalism awards from the New York Press Club and the Washington chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. He is the author of the book Bravo Company, about an Army company's harrowing deployment to Afghanistan and the soldiers' decade of reckoning after. Before joining the Journal, he was a United States Marine Corps infantry officer who deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he will discuss the experiences of soldiers assigned to Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, that served in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan in 2009 and 10, two of the deadliest years in the United States war in Afghanistan. His talk will follow the men from their initial enlistment and training through their deployment that included a major shift in their mission, and then on to what has happened as they returned to combat in other units or moved on with their lives as civilians or struggled to adjust. This lecture program is sponsored through the generous donations of FN America, a global leader in the development and manufacturing of high-quality firearms for military and law enforcement. And as we go through the program and you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. And as time allows at the end of the program, we will address those questions. Thank you. And it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Ben.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And any mention I have of FN firearms like the 240 machine gun is purely coincidental and not because of product placement. I just anybody who's been there knows they eventually have an FN. So thanks for coming out tonight. And I really appreciate your time and interest in this. I want to give a quick introduction to my background and how I came about finding the men and women who are affiliated with Bravo Company, and then I want to go through that really quickly, and I want to take questions from you all. I think questions are an integral part of this, and I know that there will be some. So that introduction summed things up pretty well from my career. I've been covering veterans in the military now for the Wall Street Journal for about a decade. And in that time, I've come across a number of stories that I would have liked to turn into book projects. This one happened to be the one I turned into a book project. I came across the men from Bravo Company, one Army company, when I was writing a story about a reunion that they had in 2019. It's called Operation Resiliency, and it was a reunion program that sought to bring together everyone from the unit. There've been unit reunions as long as time itself, right? As long as there have been military units, there's been military unions. This one, though, is different because it sought to bring everyone from that particular unit back together, because they wanted to the group that puts this on wants to bring together people with congruent experiences, not just similar experiences, but the exact same experience, so they can bond together and hopefully overcome some of the societal pressures and issues with reintegration society that often that are often placed upon people coming home. I wrote about Bravo Company and their reunion for the Wall Street Journal, and then a publisher approached me to say, "Hey, is there a book length thing to do here?" And I realized there was, a lot to write about. And anybody who has been in the military or studied the military or knows someone who's in it knows that you have an almost infinite amount of material in any one experience in combat. And by focusing on one single company's experience, because it's a small enough unit that you can focus on the individual members, the leadership, etc. By focusing on one company's experience, you're able to both look at the people at the smallest tactical level on the ground fighting and what's going through their minds and their families, and you can focus on those individuals, but that company size element can also give us a window into the biggest picture that's available at the strategic level. And so by looking at Bravo Company, I not only was able to talk to the men who had experienced combat and had experience coming home, to talk to their family members, to talk to loved ones who were left behind if they didn't come home. But I was also able to explore things all the way up to the Pentagon, to the White House, to decisions that were being made so many echelons above the company that they had no idea what was happening. And anybody who has served in a small unit knows that at a certain point you have no idea what's happening up in the ether. And I sought to answer the questions for these men of why they were there, why they had gone to Arghandab for this one deployment into the Arghandab Valley in Afghanistan. What took them there? What was the strategic decision that made them go there? Because most people don't ever find that out in their small unit, and why their small unit went there. And by focusing on the company again, I was able to look at the individual members and track individuals over time, so I could get a picture of changes that happened from moment of enlistment to deployment and first contact, to coming home, to getting out, and to coping with living that life. So that's a little background to Bravo Company and how I came about finding their story. And since I know this is the Army Heritage Center, there's a keen interest in the historical aspect of anything that is done related to scholarship, learning, education. It's not just telling war stories. It's telling war stories that are situated in a broader history, so we can gain a better understanding of things. And one thing I think is very important to talk about in the context of Army Heritage Center or any other institute like this is one of the reasons that I write about the military, and that I wrote the book Bravo Company, and that other journalists like me do similar projects, is because the military has all but abdicated its official history job of keeping and chronicling what happened on the ground. Looking back over time to past conflicts, after World War II, there were extensive histories that were put out. Now, granted, those are being put out by the company store, right? So you can't trust everything that's happening in an Army history, but at least the Army had an official history that it put out. And individual units were able to keep track of what they did. And somebody could look back and try to piece together an objective history of what happened. Well, in the global war on terror, we we essentially got rid of a lot of those official historian duties. There were, and there still are unit historians who track these things, but a lot of units don't have good histories. Not only do they not have good histories, but the things that make up history and things that you can research and find out have kind of disappeared in the modern battle space. Whereas in the previous world wars, in Vietnam, you would have logbooks, dispatches, radio logs. You would have physical pieces of paper that would document what happened on any particular patrol, or any call for fires that occurred. You would have these things that you could cross-reference. Now, just like in civilian society, where everything is done over texts and chats and whatnot, that is primarily the history that exists for the military. When you're sending up a report, oftentimes you send it over something like a Merc chat, which is just a chat program on a computer. And instead of having physical, tangible pieces of paper that can then be sorted and filed away in the National Archives and be researched later, there's digital ephemera that's flying back and forth. And sometimes that stuff is not saved. A lot of times that stuff is not saved. And unit reports for lieutenants who are putting together reports to send up to hire, those are often happening on flash drives that go between laptops, and then they're lost or thrown in the bottom of a sea bag when they come home, instead of, again, being filed to some sort of official place. So there is no good unit history that is kept for the most part in the military. When I contacted the Army to ask for the 82nd Airborne, I contacted them to ask for the official unit history for Bravo Company's deployment to Afghanistan to see what they had. And the official history that they sent me was a compilation of a history that I had asked one of the members of the company about, and they had given it to someone at the 82nd, and then that came back to me. So oddly enough, the official history I got was essentially the history that I had already been working to pry out at the unit level. And I think it's so important for us to realize that journalists on the front lines of these conflicts, or journalists who talk to veterans when they come home, is really, that's the first draft of history. And this is the tangible thing that we're going to have, that is not going to be provided by the military. And if you're in the military, or if you're talk to your member of Congress, tell them that they need to do more work to have unit histories be paid attention to. It's a very important thing. That's my public service announcement for the day. So why did I write Bravo Company other than those things I talked about? Well, the other reason that I wrote it was, I mean, they say that you write the book that you wish existed and that doesn't exist. And I had not read something that takes you from soup to nuts, from coming into the military, getting to that first unit, going through unit workup, pre-deployment workup, then deploying and the feelings of deployment and whatnot, and then that return home and dealing with veteran issues, spouse issues, family issues, issues of meaning, and was it worth it all? Most books that you read deal with combat, or they deal with people who have come home from combat. But I wanted to give a full trajectory, a full arc, as best I could, of some of these folks, and to follow them over time, and talk about their deepest connection to war, to each other, to the Army, to the ridiculousness and the sublimity that is being in the military. And I was able to follow a number of people doing this, and I hope that that it tells with rigor, and with both rigor and also a true sense of authenticity and genuineness, the feelings that that people experience in the military. And I'm a Marine. I was a Marine infantry officer before I became a journalist. And one of the things that I think was so great about writing about an Army company was that I had a facility with the language. I was able to understand what everybody, the language that people spoke, because I'd gone through a lot of those things, but I hadn't gone through exactly what they had gone through. So I, as a Marine, had to translate Army language, and it kept me on my toes. And I think it was a very important thing to be able to connect with paratroopers, speaking to them as an infantryman myself, but that language was foreign enough that I didn't get comfortable. And the Army was odd enough to me, because I'm a Marine, and you know, we're known for not being the smartest bunch out there. So it took me some time to decipher all the ins and outs of the Army and how it was different from the Marine Corps. And I think that was very important. And I hope that comes through in this book. A lot of war memoirs, or people writing about war, they can almost become too familiar with the story, with their own story, and not explain things, because they forget that the reader doesn't necessarily understand some of the jargon, some of the language. By me writing about an Army unit, that was foreign enough to me that I explained things. And I wrote the book in a way that a lay person who has never served, or doesn't even know what the rank structure is, could pick this book up and not be lost. But at the same time, because of the way that I dealt with writing about the feelings, the smells, the sounds, the deepest experience of war, people who have been there, I hope that this will also provide them with with almost an insight, or a way of making sense of their own deployments in ways that they might not have had access to before. So I want to read want to read a couple passages, and as we go, please send your questions in. And I'm happy to answer questions as we go if they're relevant and good. And I want to just I want to read a couple things, talk a little bit more about the book and the experience, and then answer questions for the rest of the time, if that works. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to capture some of the grim humor and the way that soldiers talk and think, and the way that Marines who have been in combat talk and think with each other, in ways that I think a lot of works on war don't fully capture. And there were some sections that I wrote of the book that get into some of this, that allow me to explore the way that infantrymen think, the way that they talk, and the way that they joke. And a lot of that stuff doesn't get conveyed. And if you're an infantryman who deployed, or someone who's been in the military, you'll probably recognize some of this language, and I hope it's something that that my book is able to capture, talk about, that doesn't often get mentioned. So I'm going to read a quick excerpt now. Well, I guess it's important to talk a little bit about Bravo Company's mission and the mission they had when they got to Afghanistan. So this is an 82nd Airborne company, and they were set to deploy to Iraq around the time of the election of Barack Obama. And at that time, there was a lot of focus on the Iraq War, and we're just now starting to think again about Afghanistan. And the newly elected president wanted to own that war himself, and to have a surge ready to go in there to show that we meant business in Afghanistan. Well, Bravo Company was part of their larger unit was 4th Brigade, and a brigade, if you're not familiar with it, is about the smallest piece that can be moved on the strategic chessboard. You can take that unit, move it here, there, other places. A few thousand people. It's a couple battalions, and 4th Brigade had been set to go to Iraq. Well, right before they were about to deploy, when they were doing unit workups, the administration decided that there was going to be a surge, but that the president wasn't quite ready to figure out what that surge would be. And so there was this weird little mini surge that happened. And 4th Brigade was part of that. It was essentially, the brigade was taken and sent to Afghanistan to show our allies that we meant business, and that we were going to be in it for the long haul. Now, the problem with that is, and I still have trouble saying this and believing it, even though I've reported it out and talked to multiple people about it, is 4th Brigade was deployed to Afghanistan with no real mission. And anybody who's listening to me right now is going to be in disbelief that that can be possible, because the Army doesn't do anything without giving someone a task and a purpose, a mission for what they're going to do. But 4th Brigade didn't really have a mission, and it was left up to the commander to try to figure out what that mission would be. Essentially, there were dozens of units chopped out of 4th Brigade and sent everywhere to be trainers with the Afghan military or the police forces. And the 4th Brigade was scattered to the wind. At some point, the battalion that Bravo Company was a part of, the commander figured out a way to get a real mission set, to get a definable paratrooper mission set, which was to go into the Arghandab Valley and do what paratroopers are trained to do, which is patrol and fight. So the battalion that Bravo Company is part of, they went into the Arghandab Valley, and they went into a valley that had that was semi-permissible at the time. But they went in at the exact time when the Taliban was really starting to reuse and rethink their use of IEDs. And Bravo Company saw very few firefights. What they did see a lot of were IEDs buried in the ground, and their deployment became this this horrific nightmare of just constantly patrolling, trying to stay ahead of the IED threat, trying to figure out ways to win over the local populace, but also to deal with this constant pressure of knowing that the next step could be the one that you take and and an IED blows up. Now, the Arghandab Valley, for anybody who doesn't know it well, is a lush, beautiful, fertile land that has some of the best pomegranates in the world. But lush, fertile lands are not good for booby trap fights if you're the people trying to defend against them. And Bravo Company found itself walking through heavily booby trapped and IED lands. And that's the way that they spent most of their deployment, was trying to figure out how to defeat these things and always being on the offensive as far as patrolling goes. Because again, as anybody who's been out there knows, if you hunker down and play defense, then it just allows people to set in more IEDs, to surveil you more, to do more reconnaissance on you, and to prepare to fight against you. And so there's this paradoxical aspect of, if there are tons of IEDs planted around your base, you have to go out and deal with all those, because if you don't, the situation will just get worse. And that's where Bravo found itself. Now, they at a certain point during their deployment, they started losing people. They started getting a lot of injuries, feet blown off, TBI. They had combat deaths. And the excerpt I'm going to read you right now is from about when they were in the middle of this major IED fight, where, again, very few people to shoot at. Taliban don't typically identify themselves. They blend in with the populace. And who's Taliban anyway? Is the farmer who doesn't tell you that there's an IED buried somewhere close to his land? Is he Taliban, or is he just a guy who wants to stay out of trouble, or wants Americans to get out of his country? It's an indefinite and undefined enemy. So anyway, this is an excerpt of a book from at the time when they were starting to take losses by stepping on toe poppers and other IEDs that were causing serious wounds. It got to the point for Bravo where they joked before every patrol about who'd it be that day to step on an IED. They joked because they had to. They say to each other, "Look, man, if I get blown up and lose a leg, don't try to save me." It seemed funny in the moment, but there was no way to know how serious a guy was when he said that. They never imagined the weight it heaped on their buddies, to the guys next to them. What if a guy did lose a leg? What's his buddy supposed to do? Is he supposed to honor that jokey pledge that some 19-year-old kid said as he stepped out on patrol trying to sound tough? Was that a real request? Or was his buddy supposed to realize that it's just a leg, man, and that a joke is just a joke? Does he let him bleed out, or does he save him? Well, of course, when the time comes, he saves him. Either way, after a while, that conundrum solved itself as more and more legs were lost. While legs were lost, lives were saved, because, of course, that's what a buddy does. Joke pledges be damned. As legs were lost, guys started reevaluating things. Pledges and promises evolved. They started to say, "Man, if I get blown up and I lose both legs, don't try to save me." But after a while, two legs gone didn't seem so bad. So they'd say, "Man, if I get blown up and I lose my dick, don't try and save me." That one never changed. The dick is a sacred piece of Army gear that no soldier can imagine losing. Even the balls are somewhat expendable. A guy would prefer to keep those, of course, but losing nuts isn't in the same league as getting dick blown off. Fuck that, no way. You can always joke about losing a ball or two, but dickless? No, sir. If a fellow loses a leg, even two of them, he could still get some carbon fiber blades and run around like Oscar Pistorius, that South African Olympian. He might even stay in the Army if he wanted. That was a real option. Back then, in 2009 and 10, you'd see soldiers on fake legs, still on active duty, walking around base, some looking like they were trying to hula hoop while balanced on a waterbed. By 2010, a legless soldier could get prosthetics with a set of flippers attached if he wanted to go scuba diving. Cinch a cleat on a separate one if he wanted to play some softball, and all of them free through Walter Reed. Truth to tell, down deep in a place only a soldier himself knows, he might even say, no, there's no way he could even say it, not out loud. He'd think quietly to himself, shit, a missing leg would be rock solid proof of my bona fides. It would prove I've been there. Man, it might even get me some free beers at Applebee's. That fantasy beer would then lead to dreams of getting laid. It might be easy pickings with the ladies, using that peg leg badge of honor for everyone to see at the bar. Free beers, maybe a couple appetizers, and everyone at the bar staring at that leg of his, just imagining how he lost it. Let them imagine the worst. Civilians and rear echelon motherfuckers. Ooh, baby, how they would stare at it. PTSD, TBI, and all the rest. It doesn't often register in a young soldier's mind when thinking about the consequences of war. But who's got time to worry about all that? Hey, and on top of all those free Bud Lights and tater skins would be that holy grail, a pension from the Department of Defense, healthcare from the VA. Whew, now that would be living. And he might think to himself, pants? He never have to wear pants again. He could be like that double amputee veteran senator who rolled around Washington in a wheelchair, or the guy in Congress walking around in a suit on Capitol Hill, but no pants. The guy wore shorts with the suit, which meant that everybody could see his prosthetics as he limped around the Capitol. That was the way to do it, man. Pants would hide from the goddamn civilians that glorious carbon fiber prosthetic at the bottom of his stump that he was already dreaming about. In his mind's eye, some crusty Vietnam vet at one end of the bar would give him a knowing nod of the head. Same time, in his mind's eye, at the other end of the bar, there would be some other veteran having a drink, a pussy-ass pogue veteran, who would just stare ashamedly at that sweet stump. Ha ha! No free wings or jalapeno poppers for that asshole. But wait, this dreamer might think, a guy might lose more than a leg. It's not like he's got it in writing from the Taliban. They'll just take a foot or something. Yeah. Maybe on second thought, it's best just not to step on an IED at all. A fellow can't guarantee it's just a leg after all. He might get killed. Or worse, a blown off dick and balls. And a dude like that isn't picking up chicks at the bar, no how. Not a good trade-off for the appetizers. A soldier, if he has to make a deal with the cosmic reality, make a deal with God, well, a lost leg is a deal to make. And no way an arm. Shit, losing an arm would be awful. A missing leg looks cool, but a guy missing an arm just looks like some charity case out of a World War I scrapbook. A guy can't do basic shit without an arm, right? Can't even wipe his ass properly. Besides, how would you get an arm blown off anyway, with IEDs buried in the ground so close to feet and legs? Well, it can happen. Anything can happen in war, because there's no deal making with the Taliban. There's no deal making with cosmic reality. There's no deal making with God. So that was that's an excerpt where I tried to sort of get into some of the ridiculous thoughts that that an infantryman thinks, and now infantry women. And of course, in the book, I talk about the men of Bravo Company, because back in this time there were no women in forward combat units, which is why the language is gendered in that way. But for the book, I did talk to spouses. I talked to parents of folks who didn't return, and I think that was an extraordinarily important thing to include in the book, is not just the perspective of the soldiers who were there, not just the perspective of the rank and file soldiers, not just the perspective of the officers or the senior enlisted. I included both of those because, again, a lot of books don't address the full complement of experience of war, I don't think, and a lot of times there's a focus on what the enlisted are thinking. There's focus on what the officers are thinking, but to make sure that both of those perspectives are brought to bear in a work is so important, because there's so many different vantage points in any part of conflict. And of course, one of those vantage points is the loved one who is who remains behind when war begins. And I have a section where I write about the feelings that spouses have when a loved one is deployed, and how they can never know whether this is the moment that the folks in dress uniforms will pull up in a cheap government issue sedan and come knock on their door to tell them their loved one has died. There's no way to know if that moment is coming at any given time. The only time that a loved one knows that their soldier's safe is when they're on the phone with them, on a sat phone call or a phone call from a recreation facility. And as soon as that phone is hung up, that infantryman could be put into mortal danger yet again. And there's this incredible tension with the spouse that doesn't get enough attention, which is that every moment is a moment of deepest anxiety. And also that spouses and loved ones, they go on about their lives without the soldier there. A soldier is going through a horrific and terrible, stressful job, being deployed in a combat zone. But at the same time, the spouse is left at home with the kids, having to deal with all the stuff that happens back home, getting kids off to school, cleaning up messes, dealing with the house, dealing with bills, and also never knowing whether or not their loved one is safe. And it's an incredible stress that I wanted to make sure I conveyed in the book as well. One important aspect of a soldier's life that also it's been covered, but I didn't think that I think in some ways it hasn't been covered adequately, which is we always know in retrospect what we would have done in any situation. And even as civilian bystanders looking at something that would happen in the news, if you're watching the evening news and you see that something bad happened down at the Piggly Wiggly, and there was a fight or a shooting or something, you think, wow, it should have been so obvious how to deal with that. Somebody should have tackled the person. But in the helter-skelter melee of the actual, when something's actually happening, it's so much harder to make a decision, even when the decision should seem clear-cut. And that's never more true than it is in a combat situation, especially the kind of combat that Bravo Company and others from the Global War on Terror experienced, because there were a lot of times not going up against uniformed adversaries. They were going up against people who dressed like civilians, blended in with civilian population. And only in retrospect were they able to say, oh, that person, that suicide bomber was clearly a bad guy. And, I would have acted in a situation like that. Or looking back on it saying, well, that person that sniper that took a pot shot, it should have been clear to us that window was where that pot shot would have come from. How could we not have seen that? Well, it's pretty damn hard to see those things as it's happening, as combat's unfolding. And I wanted to capture that with one soldier who experienced that. And one of the important things about the experience of looking back and saying, well, how could I have done something differently, is that it's something that lives with you forever. And if for anyone who's been in a combat situation or knows veterans who have been there, there's this constant pressure to reevaluate decisions that were made in a combat zone. And it's something that people live with for the rest of their lives. And sometimes they force their loved ones and those around them to live with it as well. And I think it's something that's very important to capture. And I wrote about a situation like this where a young soldier, named Flake. His last name is Flake. Flake was a good guy, really good friends with another soldier named Alan Thomas. And Flake, he had the chance to stop a suicide bomber, or at least in retrospect, he thinks he had the chance to stop a suicide bomber, and it's something that lives with him down deep in his heart, even today, as we speak. It's something that haunts him, and making the decision to kill someone is not a light decision to make, even if a bad guy is clearly identified. So it's even harder to make a decision if a bad guy is not clearly identified. And I want to read you this this section again. Jordan Flake is the soldier's name, and there was a suicide bomber, and the suicide bomber severely injured his friend and squad leader, Alan Thomas. So those are the two names that are important for this section. Well, one day in March, Bravo Company was out on patrol when they set up a snap checkpoint in the road, which is a common practice. An American patrol would just decide to stop vehicles and people and give them a look-see, like cops on the beat. Jordan Flake was out there on that patrol, and they set up a checkpoint at the intersection of a road. It's kind of a screwy way to do it, he says in retrospect. There's too many variables in an intersection. And Flake was put in a position where he could best bring the firepower of his SAW light machine gun to bear if needed. They were out there with some Afghan police doing a partnered mission. Those Afghans were useful to talk to the locals, but anytime they were involved, it was hard to make sure things went smoothly. Maybe like doing carpentry without a tape measure or something. With the Afghan forces, there was always a feeling they were winging it to some extent. They could never be sure things would be just right. In this case, there was an Afghan policeman who was sort of in Flake's way. Not too much, but just enough that he might edge into Flake's line of sight if he needed to fire that SAW. Soon after they set in the checkpoint, Flake remembers a man and his son came through riding a tractor. They were just farmers doing their farmer thing, and they seemed nice enough. Well, 5 minutes later, as far as Flake reckons, a different young man came walking their way, real slow and real weird. The soldiers told each other to keep an eye on the guy. The man kept walking toward them, mumbling to himself. When Flake thinks back on it now, he remembers the guy had a spiffy new set of black clothes on. They were spotless. It was as if he was dressed for a special occasion. Flake thought something wasn't right with this guy, but that realization didn't come with ample time to decide and react. In retrospect, there's always ample time to look at everything that happened and make sense of it. But at the time, things moved so fast, it was hard to make a decision. It's always hard to make a decision. It was hard even to process that there was a decision to make. This guy was an odd fellow, and he came on as fast as time itself, unstopping. It seemed he was about 10 feet away now, and the Afghan cop and the guy, they started yelling at each other. Or were they just talking loudly? Damn it, the cop was in the way now. He was hollering at the guy. Flake couldn't shoot him if he wanted to, or at least that's what he tells himself in retrospect. But he could have shot. His job was to be the first one to decide to shoot if there was trouble. Yet Flake had let that man keep coming, step after step, time flying by in every moment. After all, deciding to kill someone isn't easy. It's easy enough to talk about killing when you're a spectator. Watching war films, it seems downright simple to know who the bad guy is and when to shoot at him. It's easy for someone from the outside to say what they would have done. For people who have been there, they know it's not so easy in the moment. Sure, in war, there's sometimes a bad guy with a uniform and a gun who's shooting at you, and that makes the decision straightforward and even easy. But a soldier rarely knows for sure what the hell is happening, even when he's in the middle of it. Still, for people who have been there, they can often look back on things and make a declaration about it. In retrospect, even a soldier who knows how hard it is in the moment can look back and think there was a clear-cut, obvious course of action. In the moment, it's not easy at all. When there's a guy coming at you wearing civilian clothes, it's not easy at all. It's not easy when a guy is taking a step closer and another. Deciding to kill someone is not a decision that can be undone. The act is final. It's definite. After an event is done and over with, there's a teleological certainty to it. It almost seems that it had to happen the way it did. But at the time, each moment is pregnant with possibility, with a different direction that can be taken. There is no inevitable. That moment when Flake could have acted took forever, and yet at the same time was gone immediately. Afterward, there's only one way for the event to have happened. That can't be changed. But there is no telos in the midst of war, no predestined outcomes in the here and now. Everyone's had a moment like that, a few seconds of their life where the fabric of time stretches and expands. Maybe it's a motorcycle wreck with the skid and then going over the handlebars, waiting for your body to hit the road in a suspended moment's eternity. Perhaps it's a more pleasant reverie, a high school basketball game with a high arcing three-pointer finding nothing but net, that traced arc lasting an eternity as it's happening, yet gone in the moment. Gone, yes, but it can come back again and again, recalled from memory to be replayed. Perhaps that moment is something more important in the grand scheme of things. Maybe the moment a partner sees their child's head crown as a woman gives birth, that wonderful forever that lasts but a moment. And in those moments, a thinking person knows for certain that time is not set fast in stone. It can bend and warp and shrink and lengthen. It's only a fool who thinks that a second lasts a second, or that a minute lasts a minute. No, a second can last a minute. A second gives enough time to think and reason and wonder and reflect, and to act even, or not act. Time to feel a sinking dread in the stomach, a visceral dread. A moment like that can last forever, even as time races forward. A moment like that, a moment filled with meaning, also rips the fabric of time itself. It creates a place, a time, that a person can return to at will, or where they're sometimes transported to against their will. Those moments create places where, like Billy Pilgrim of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, a man can just come unstuck in time. Vonnegut reveals the truth of time to us, that Pilgrim goes through the horrors of World War II and finds himself unwittingly jumping from past to present to future, hopping through the moments with no control over how it happens. He goes from combat to civilian life and back again. For Billy Pilgrim, for Jordan Flake, for Alan Thomas and other combat veterans, those rips in time where a man comes unstuck are very real. Go ahead, ask any of them about it. Those rips in time can be nightmares. And just as Billy Pilgrim learns that free will is a passing fancy, gone in a moment, so too does a man like Flake or Alan Thomas. Free will is a funny thing, because while we have control over what we do, at the same time, it might as well be an illusion, because the possibility of action lasts a flash of a moment, and then it's gone. Turn into the hard fact of history, of the past, something unchangeable. Free will becomes a prison of regret. Envisaging a moment is more than remembering it. Remembering is what you do when you talk about multiplication tables, or who led the majors and dingers the year you turn 12. Visiting a moment like that actually transports a person from the present into the past. He relives it in the most literal sense. It makes a man seem like a crazy person, staring off into the distance, living a past moment as if it's happening right now. Once a man has been to war, Billy Pilgrim doesn't seem crazy, and Slaughterhouse-Five doesn't seem like science fiction. Billy is the normal one. He's normal. He's normal to a man who has experienced one of those eternal moments, one of those rips in time. He's normal to a man like Flake, who knows that moment a suicide bomber took a step closer. And another. And when he started yelling at the policeman, and when that policeman raised his gun and pointed it at the man, when the man mumbled something as he raised his hands and took another step, when he mumbled, Allahu Akbar. Now, when that moment when the young man mumbled Allahu Akbar, nothing was determined. Flake was a young American in an uncertain place, watching another young man who had walked toward him, and now the man had his hands up, a fellow human being. In that moment, Flake could have made a choice. In theory, he could have changed the progress of history and exerted his free will in the situation. Shoot or don't shoot. But as that moment slid by, there was so much to calculate. And there's something deep within a soldier's breast, fundamental to a person like Flake, to his very nature. There are those out there who have dark souls, and they are bad men who move among us. But we must believe in a fundamental goodness in ourselves and in those we interact with. If we lose hope in that, we might as well give up on the project of life itself. We must believe in the good. For a soldier like Jordan Flake, that goodness was as much a part of him as his soul, unchanging and pure. It was the unflinching human love that lies within us all. The thing that was deep within Flake in that moment where he was trying to make a decision to end another human's life. It was the divine, the infinite held in a passing moment. The very breath of God swirled around Jordan Flake, reminding him that the young Afghan in front of him too was a man. Or perhaps Flake just didn't act. Simple as that. Who's to say? So that's a snapshot of a moment of combat, and the decision making process that comes during a tense combat situation. I haven't talked much at all about the veteran aspect of all this, but I know that some time has gone by, and I really want to answer some questions and to be interactive and to hear what people are thinking. So I don't know if any questions have come in, and if so, I'd love to take them.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing what you've written there and your commentary on it. We do have a few questions. Ed Root was wondering if, as a result of the constant tension of the IEDs, did the men tend to react from a sense of vengeance when in an actual firefight against a visible and identifiable enemy?
That is an excellent question. And the men from Bravo Company, by the time they were this deep into this IED experience, they really weren't. They never had a firefight that allowed them to have that cathartic release. I talk in the book about how an infantryman is trained to want and expect and anticipate a cathartic release during a firefight, which is something that it's almost unholy to talk about, but in good company. But it's something that infantrymen are trained and want to do. They want to execute their mission, and they want to do that, and they want to have those firefights. Bravo Company was never able to really have that when they started having this IED infusion of IEDs in their battle space. And whether or not, from what I can tell, from what I've been able to report and research and talk to a number of men and people involved in this, there were no retributive sort of actions that were taken by Bravo Company because of the undue pressures that they were under. And I don't know if that's because of the discipline that they were under from their leadership, or if simply there wasn't an opportunity to have that sort of uncorking of stress and of the possibility of having retributive action. It's one of the reasons why this was why this deployment had such pressure on these men, because there was never a release valve once they got into that IED fight. It was just constant patrolling, constantly hitting things. There were very few locals that they interacted with, and of course, very few firefights. So there was no real ability to have an outlet for that pressure. And these men brought that back home with them when they came home. And I would say that sort of the first answer to that question is not that I have reported on or know of. The second part of the question is that they brought all that with them when they came home, and that they've been trying to unpack that for the past more than a decade, and that has affected many men's personal lives and family lives, and trying to readjust to civilian life once coming home. So thank you for the question.
All right. Our next question is from Mike Perry, who's noted that World War II units often held reunions with the support of their higher commanders. In your opinion, did the ad hoc nature of headquarters and units that scattered after deployment in Afghanistan make it more difficult to bring the units together?
Yes. I very rarely answer a question with one word, but yes. I think there's a number of things that that go into the lack of reunions now, relatively speaking. I mean, they still happen, of course, and the Operation Resiliency was a reunion that was pushed with sort of outside pressures, and then the unit itself was able to come back together. Now, Bravo Company, they were able to have an effective reconnection. As a unit, because they had gone through such a crucible during their time in deployment. And it seems to me, by watching all this and reporting all this and looking at historical artifacts and documents, is that units that have those tempering experiences of combat or war are more likely to stay in touch with each other and come back together, and have those sort of reunion experiences. I mean, that's true wherever you go, right? Like, if you played on some crummy football team in college, you probably don't talk to people that much. But if you played on a team that was bonded together through hardship and hard-earned victory, you probably keep in touch with people. And same thing goes for any sort of small unit on the civilian or military side of things. I think that coming out of the Civil War and World Wars I and II, units, you're likely to stick with a unit a little bit longer, and you might deploy a couple times or for the duration of the war with one unit. There were programs where you would go in with your friends from your hometown to some of these things, and then when you got out of the military, there was a lot of times there was a more of a, I don't know, like for lack of a better word, a small town ethos in America, right? You go back to where you came from and you lived your life. And the one really big thing you did was you went to war, and that's why you stayed in touch with people, went to reunions. Now they're in modern society, there's constant displacement. We're moving, our friends are moving. You can't send a letter to your buddy's hometown and hope that it gets to him or her. They're changing their phone numbers all the time, going here and there. Units, the military's ethos now is to rotate people through, right? So anybody who served knows that you're going to be, most likely you're going to be in a unit for a couple years, and then you go someplace else across the country, across the world. You don't stick with a unit for your entire career. So you have all these competing unit identities that you're part of, different friend groups. None of them maybe take this, major holistic, this was my war experience and these are my war buddies. And I think that contributes to some of this. Also, travel is something that we do quite regularly now, but we don't, but it's not like a big deal. I mean, we might fly to Hawaii next week for vacation. We might fly to London to see family members or whatever. You don't say, hey, I'm going to have a big unit reunion once every 3-5 years. I'm taking the train to St. Louis for it or something. That just doesn't happen that much these days. I think that all that fragmentation has to do with it. And military leadership is, they move on to different units. The commander of Bravo Company, Adam Armstrong, I mean, he's a lieutenant colonel now, and he still keeps in touch with these men who are in his company, which is an incredible feat. It still boggles my mind that this man has put in the time and effort and cares so deeply for the men who are in his command that he still reaches out to them regularly just to check in on them. And anybody who has served knows that to have somebody who has the humanity and the time and the drive to do that is an incredible thing. And I think that also contributes to the reason the Bravo Company was able to have so many people come together for the reunion that I covered and to stay in touch with each other, is because some of the leadership, they saw this deployment that I wrote about as one of the defining deployments, or maybe the defining deployment of their military career. And they have put in the effort to stay in touch and to keep those sort of informal positions of leadership. So when Bravo Company came back for their reunion, the former company commander was there. The former first sergeant was there, who retired as a command sergeant major. The squad leaders were there. Platoon commanders were there. There was a lot of that leadership structure that was pulling everybody together, and I think a lot of that gets lost in the modern military. I hope that answered your question. And if you have a follow on to that, I'd love to hear it.
All right. David Woolman was asking if your research discovered how the senior enlisted and the officers who were on their second or third deployment were dealing with their personal experiences, PTSD or whatever. And he notes that he's assuming they might be holding a lot inside for concern of their future advancement, promotions, or assignments, and how that might have impacted their careers and family relationships.
Thank you. Yeah, so the 2010 timeframe, right, I wrote about the Bravo Company, was the time when people were just, I don't know, like just really starting to talk about some of this stuff. Up until the mid 2000s, when the global war on terror was still relatively young, and there was really no talk of PTSD and all that stuff. It was something that you avoided, and there was serious concern over promotions, over even like if you could stick with your unit if you mentioned that you were having any kind of issues. And I think that, from my experience and the experience of Marines that I know, and now these soldiers that I've talked to, and all the people that I've talked to in reporting military and veteran issues for the past decade, I think that there was almost like a subliminal or underlying concern about what would happen to your career and what would happen to your reputation if you mentioned something about some of the combat stresses that you'd faced and the way that they were affecting you as a person, as a leader, as a soldier. And at the time of writing about Bravo, I think that some of the leadership and senior enlisted who had experienced combat trauma, I don't even know if they necessarily recognized the existence of it. And it wasn't so much them actively saying, oh, if I go talk to somebody about this is going to spike my career. Or if I go talk to somebody about this, it might not get a promotion or whatever. I think it was that they refused to recognize that it even existed, because that's how much there was a suppression of these concerns. The one of the people I talked to for the book was the senior enlisted for Bravo Company in this deployment, got out as a command sergeant major, Donald McAllister. And Mac, he sort of was charging so hard the entire time he was in the Army, and people looked up to him, and he knew he had to be the hard ass who got everything right, and trained men so that they could come home from war and they could do their mission while they were there. He just didn't even think about combat stresses, and it was not something that would affect him, and partially because he didn't have time for it to affect him. And he recounted to me, and this is a scene in the book. He recounted to me that when he was getting ready to process out for retirement, anybody who's been on a military base and goes to a new unit knows they give you the sheet, the checkout sheet, right? With like 1 million people you have to go see, and it's like you got to go see the doctor, the dentist. You got to go see the people who issued you some gear. You got to go see this, that, and the other person who signed your little sheet. And one of the people you have to go see is behavioral health, right? Somebody who deals with combat stress and stuff. And Mac went and took his checkout sheet because he just wanted to get the tick off the box. And he started talking to the person, and it was as if an edifice kind of broke. And he was suddenly hit by these by all the stuff that he'd been accumulating and putting way down deep inside and locking up for his entire career. And he realized, man, I gotta maybe I should deal with this and talk about it. And now Mac is Mac is a I think it's fair to say he's a crusader for people to talk about this stuff and to address these issues, because it's something that that the majority of, if not everyone who's been to combat experiences, and that by not addressing it properly, it can negatively affect the way that you lead other soldiers in training and in combat situations. And Mac is somebody who wants to make sure that that soldiers feel comfortable talking to him about the things that he experienced, and that they take that, if they're still in, they take that back to their units, and they make sure that there are conversations that are occurring so that people can unpack this stuff, and that it doesn't boil over or pop or explode, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So I think that there is that combat stress that is present, and even now people are concerned about mentioning it. Whether they're veterans who are now out or people who are in uniform, there is a certain concern about talking about it, right? Because there is a perception of weakness, no matter how much it becomes destigmatized, or no matter how much strong people and people who you look up to and admire talk about these things, there's still an aspect of it where people just don't want to talk about it. And I think that back in more than a decade ago, that was even more the case. And so it wasn't necessarily a conscious like locking up of these emotions, but it was a de facto thing that happened. And it probably, I think it probably did affect the way that people trained, the way that people led. And if you look at some of the arguments we're having in politically and in society, with society right now, and how the military should be run, how we should treat soldiers, how soldiers should treat each other, a lot of this stuff is just now playing out after dealing with it for the past 20 years of the global war on terror.
Okay, we have no more questions from the audience, and we're running out of time, but I do have one more question I think is kind of an important one. Do the soldiers of Bravo Company feel that their time in Afghanistan was a success, and however they measure it, success in their mission, success as as soldiers, how do they feel about it?
No and yes, yes and no. And there is an ambivalence to that, to the answer to that question. And one of the things in talking to the men of Bravo Company and those people who were around them and love them and are close to them, is the recognition of an ambivalence, and the recognition that it's okay to have that ambivalence. I mean, we want to have clear-cut answers to everything, right? Especially in the Army. Like, the Army wants a black and white answer to something. They want yes or no, affirmative, negative, whatever. They want to, like, hey, this mission was a success, this mission was a failure. But at the end of the day, by looking, again, being able to focus in on a company, this small element, I was able to really draw out that ambiguity. And it's something that resonates with me personally. For my deployments, it's something that resonates with a lot of people who I talk to who have deployed. I mean, we can be extraordinarily proud of our service, while at the same time being extraordinarily skeptical of what its ultimate end was. We can be extraordinarily proud of how we performed on deployment, while at the same time being extraordinarily ashamed of the way we performed, because on any given day, at any given time, there are so many decisions that happen in the crucible of war. And each one of those decisions, as the flake section that I read you sort of shows, each one of those decisions can go in so many different directions, and they could change the course of an entire deployment. They could change the course of an entire war sometimes. The company commander, Adam Armstrong, and I talked to him in one section. There was a vehicle-borne IED that blew up one of their outposts that they had, and he knows that it's his fault that happened, because he, as the company commander, could have ordered any sort of changes to where that outpost was placed, its fortifications, the roads that could approach it. But if he makes a decision that changes whether or not that VBIED blows up on that outpost, he might make a decision that changes the trajectory of the way that they are interacting with a certain tribe in the area. They may make the one farmer mad, who then puts in an IED that blows everyone up. Like every variable that is tweaked changes another variable. And I think that when a soldier realizes that, or a Marine realizes that, during their time in conflict, they were part of this machine that had so many variables, all whirring and whizzing at all times and changing, it can give a certain amount of peace to know there is no black and white answer. The men from Bravo Company that I spoke with are extraordinarily proud of their time in uniform. They're extraordinarily proud of what they did, what they accomplished, that they were able to do, that they were able to essentially push back the Taliban on this, in this area that was it's like a super highway of a rat line that cuts across the country that the Taliban uses. And Bravo Company, I mean, I talked to a general who had observed their work and said that they did their mission. They stopped a lot of this rat line stuff that was happening, but the things that they stopped, the things they affected, they don't have any direct visibility on that. They can't know that that's happening. They can only know that when they went on a patrol on this day or that day or every day, that they did their best to keep the men to their left and right safe, to follow the commander's orders, and to treat the civilian population with dignity and respect. And they are proud of that. Now, whether or not the outcome of the war was what they would have chosen, almost every veteran I've spoken with, in fact, I can't think of any veteran who is happy about the way that Afghanistan ended. And I'm not saying that from a political standpoint or to grind an axe or anything. I'm just saying that every veteran I've spoken to who served in Afghanistan is not happy with the way things ended. But all wars must end. And to not have a period at the end of this conflict, but to have a comma or whatever punctuation that doesn't have a definitive end to it, also affects whether or not the men think that their mission was ultimately successful, because it's not just their deployment, it's how their deployment fits in as a particular variable into the broader 20 years of war in Afghanistan. So the long and the short of it is, they are very proud of their time in Afghanistan, and they're also skeptical and reevaluate their time in country and in uniform at all times. And I think that when they get the people who give themselves permission to recognize the ambiguity of the outcomes of war, and the fact that there will never be a black and white answer to it, the people who are able to live with that world of infinite gray are able to come out on the other side of war with a better balance, knowing that they need to keep asking questions and asking questions of themselves, and never come up with a definitive answer. So I guess that's the best I can say about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time together. I am going to give you, I just mentioned, I presume your book is available on Amazon and at fine bookstores everywhere. So I encourage our audience members to go out and obtain a copy of that and learn more about the Men of Bravo Company. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And Ben, thank you once again for your time. And we do have a question, just a note in the box saying, from Michelle saying, excellent, thank you all. So with that, good night to everyone.